Welcome to the Chrisman Commentary Daily Mortgage News Podcast. I'm your host, Robbie Chrisman. Topics on today's episode include conference chatter from around the nation, my interview with Polunsky Beitel Green's Peter Idziak on takeaways from the bipartisan Homebuyers Privacy Protection Act, and there's a lot to digest between a softening labor market and sticky inflation. Thanks to today's podcast sponsor, Indicom. Indicom combines mortgage AI, intelligent automation, machine learning, and intelligent document processing with mortgage operational expertise to ensure that every solution is accurate, scalable, and impactful as it is innovative. Indicom's AI-powered tools, like Income Genius, Decision Genius, and IDX Genius AI, aren't off-the-shelf solutions. They're tailored and purpose-built for mortgage operations, trained on vast mortgage datasets, and refined by the feedback of operations teams, underwriters, and QC professionals. This practical focus means faster implementations, fewer errors, and a much shorter time to value. Lenders everywhere seem to be discussing early payoff penalties and strategies to avoid them. Of course, that means explaining to newer entrants why few investors would ever pay 102 or 104 for a loan that may pay off soon at 100. Talk to any solid loan originator and they'll tell you that the top three attributes of their brethren are focus, leadership, and consistency. Really? Huh. The Consumer Price Index for August came in slightly higher than expected at 0.4% month over month versus expectations of a 0.3% month over month increase and after a 0.2% month over month rise in July. Though the annual number increased, total CPI was up 2.9% year over year versus 2.7% in July. It registered in line with expectations. However, August's reading is the highest since January. Core CPI was 0.3% month over month, in line with expectations, while year-over-year core CPI was unchanged at 3.1%, still well above the Fed's 2.0% inflation target, though that figure is specifically for PCE. Food prices rose drastically in August, up 0.5%, as did shelter, which was up 0.4%, and transportation services, which were up 1.0%. Your takeaway? The increase isn't enough to keep the Fed from cutting rates next week, and 50 basis points is still on the table, though unlikely. There was also a sharp 27,000 jump in weekly jobless claims, from 236,000 to 263,000 for the week ending September 6th, lifting the series to its highest level since October 2021. It's yet another weakening labor market signal, this time showing that employers are firing more workers than expected, as expectations were for a figure of around 235,000. Continuing claims printed at 1.939 million for the week ending August 30th, unchanged from the prior week. The figures reinforce labor market worries and the quickening drumbeat of worsening news on the economic front, from jobs to manufacturing and inflation. Your takeaway? October and December rate cuts are also squarely on the table. The combination of reports, that's the weaker labor market and persistent inflation, had stagflationary implications, with both presenting a stiffening headwind to growth. Accordingly, the 10-year Treasury note yield dipped to touch 4.00%. The long bond held around post-data highs into the early afternoon, while 2-year Treasuries briefly found 3.5%. 10-year Treasury notes have now dropped 27 basis points in yield in September alone, while the 2-10s curve is 10 basis points flatter than just 11 days ago. Yes, we've seen longer duration mortgages that trade at a discount drop in rate, but coupons with ample liquidity haven't followed suit, largely due to servicer recapture strategies. Your takeaway? It appears that a recession is yet to be fully priced in. Yesterday's $22 billion 30-year Treasury bond reopening offered a barometer of the demand for duration at a moment when the long end has proven to be a continuous underperformer on the curve. Though Wednesday's 10-year auction was remarkably well received, we received only a fair result at yesterday's supply event. The bid-cover ratio came in at 2.38x, just under the 2.42 average, reflecting steady demand. Non-dealer participation was solid at 90.0%, above average, and direct bidders were notably stronger than usual, taking 28% versus a 23% norm, while indirect bidders were awarded 62%, slightly below the average of 63.4%. Heading into the auction, bonds were rallying on strong volumes, with 30-year yields approaching session lows. However, yields edged higher in the post-auction follow-through. Since 2017, 30-year auctions tailed 79% of the time when preceding 10-year auctions stopped through by at least a basis point. A Fed focused on the employment mandate over inflation would put upward pressure on longer dated securities, with long bond rates trading at some of the lowest levels since early May. 30-year mortgages don't follow 30-year Treasury bonds, but mortgage rates yet again hit new year-to-date lows and are the lowest since last October, per Freddie Mac's primary mortgage market survey for the week ending September 11th. The 30-year mortgage fell 15 basis points to 6.35%, and the 15-year rate slid 10 basis points to 5.50%, respectively. Those levels are at their respective lowest since 6.32% and 5.41% on October 4th of 2024. For today's interview, I wanted to welcome back to the show Polunsky Beitel Green's Peter Idziak to discuss takeaways from the bipartisan Homebuyers Protection Privacy Act, that's the Trigger Leads bill, which amends the Fair Credit Reporting Act by shifting trigger leads to an opt-in system, mandates a study on text-based solicitations, and raises concerns about its impact on credit bureau revenue and market competition.
We finally got the trigger lead bill signed into effect by President Donald Trump. It's called the Homebuyers Privacy Protection Act. I think this thing has been discussed to death in a lot of ways. Anything interesting to you worth commenting on now that it's finally in law?
Well, I think there's one interesting thing is that midway through the process, there was a provision added that requires the GAO to conduct a study and report back to Congress within 12 months of the effective date of the act on the use of text messages as trigger leads and to see if there's any value there. So to the extent that we might be thinking, okay, all trigger leads are now banned forevermore, there is still at least, some thing out there that might lead to a future revision to the act to allow for text message trigger leads. That's something I haven't really seen talked about a lot. Beyond that, it's pretty much what your audience has undoubtedly seen reported in the news media, that we're sort of switching from an opt-out system where the consumer would have to register their contact information with the do not call list to an opt-in system with some limited exceptions. So now a consumer can opt in to receive trigger leads, solicitations from creditors that are obtaining their information through a trigger lead, or the exceptions to the ban are for lenders that are either the originator or the servicer on the consumer's existing mortgage, or if the creditor is a bank or credit union that has an existing banking relationship with the consumer.
Could one argue that this makes lending less competitive? Because you would think and maybe it's a different avenue, but if you had a true marketplace where consumers could shop, then they would get the best rate. This limits competition in a sense, restricts it to companies that they're competitive. Obviously, nobody wants to be bombarded with 90 phone calls, but you also don't want to be gate kept, if you will, away from good rates. Thoughts on what this means for competition or kind of the future of competition marketplace, maybe consolidation in the industry?
Well, it's interesting. Your point is well taken, but there isn't a lot of information out there that I am aware of on whether, as you say, being bombarded with over 100 calls actually makes you less likely to shop any other lender. You can imagine a scenario where a prospective borrower goes out, applies for their first lender, and says, I'm gonna see what I get, and then I'm gonna go and comparison shop to a couple of the lenders, and all of a sudden, that very same day, now I'm getting bombarded with 100, 150 calls. Well, I'm not going to bother shopping at all anymore because I've been sort of turned off from the whole process. So there is some anecdotal stories out there both ways. I think in a perfect world, there could perhaps have been some sort of reformation of it. But, we have to deal with the practicalities of the way the marketplace is actually developed. And it was sort of, I think, agreed that it was better to be an all or none kind of scenario. So, yeah, to your point, could it limit competition? Perhaps, but borrowers still do have the ability to, and this will be an interesting area to see develop, to opt in to receive those leads. So it'll be interesting to see what credit bureaus and what some lenders sort of cook up to capture those leads because they are valuable for other creditors that aren't just the original creditor because that is someone who is actively applied for a mortgage loan.
The answer could be no, but do you have any further thoughts on how you speculate that arena might develop? It seems like something you've given a little bit of thought to.
That's hard to say. This is a valuable area, a revenue stream for the credit bureaus. So I think they sort of, they initially had tried to water down the bill, but I think saw that was going nowhere. This passed the Senate unanimously. It passed the House by a voice vote. So no objections. It was signed into law. So, truly a bipartisan moment in this Congress, which is a bit unusual. So I could see them coming up with some sort of system that allows for an opt-in process so they can still continue to capture that revenue stream. And, there are still, especially for brokers, this was for a lot of brokers a valuable source of leads. So to the extent that you can, capture that opt-in, I think you will see some development there because it just has been a useful way for credit bureaus to increase revenue and for prospective lenders, brokers to capture sort of live leads.
You alluded to it slightly in your answer there. It passed the Senate unanimously. It had unopposed approval in the House, which is so rare these days. Can you talk just about how amazing it is that it was this it passed in this fashion? It seems like you never get anything like this in America these days.
I mean, there is actually a lot on the more, I think you'd say, like technical and obviously less politically charged. We saw that sort of with the VA partial claims as well. That was something that sort of sped through. But yeah, I think here, the just the broad base of the problem that for every borrower who maybe benefited from a trigger lead, you had 10 times at least that number that were just swamped by these calls, texts, emails from trigger leads. And you had not just constituents that were objecting to this, but you had members of Congress themselves that had experienced this. And nothing sort of gets you moving on anything, whatever your own experience has been very poor with it. And you have to give credit to the trade associations for really getting behind this and making this a priority and working both sides of the aisle to get it done.
We saw that there were some third-party callers that falsely claimed affiliation with the consumer's chosen lender, which going forward, third-party contact can only be for legitimate credit offers and under specific conditions. There's consent or they have previous relationships. Penalties now, has that been discussed at all, or what's there to dissuade companies from manipulating borrower info at this point?
So the act amends the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So the existing penalty structure for violations of the FCRA apply. So that would be actual damages if you suffered any actual damages, or statutory damages up to $1,000. There could be punitive damages. You could see, potential class actions in here, and there are civil penalties. And this is an area under the FCRA that would be regulated by the CFPB. And notwithstanding what's going on at the Bureau, they have stated that they intend to make, mortgages a priority and areas where there's actual harms to consumers a priority. Given that this is some legislation that was signed by President Trump, you would assume that to the extent the Bureau is, going after violators in the mortgage space, this would be one area they focus on.
Mm-hmm. MBA has touted this as such a massive legislative victory. And while they're not necessarily doing a victory lap, this has such bipartisan support out there. It took them so long to finally get it across the finish line. Should MBA be touting this as a huge victory, or is this something that people should kind of be like, yeah, this is a no-brainer. Why didn't you get it done sooner?
Well, I mean, I think they definitely should be touting it as a victory. There's a lot of good ideas that everybody agrees should happen that just don't go anywhere. So you really need someone, in this case, MBA and a lot of the other trade associations, actively shepherding this through the process. Dealing with any concerns, making it a priority. It was one of the focuses at the MBA's Advocacy Day, and telling those stories to Congress people. And I was in a meeting at the Advocacy Day with a congressman who, he wasn't fully aware of the trigger lead bill. This was early in the process. We briefed him on it. Mentioned all the concerns that constituents have, that borrowers have had, and he turned to his aide and said, "Okay, we support that. Like, let's make sure that we're on board with that." And
Yeah.
just little things like that add up over time. And don't forget that although this ended up being largely passed unanimously, there are parties on the other side, the credit bureaus specifically, that were working early in the process to water it down, and were unsuccessful. So I think it is a well-deserved victory lap for MBA.
These dang credit bureaus. Everyone complains about the credit costs. They're trying to scuttle bills that most people in the mortgage industry would like to see get passed. Maybe they're the true enemy here in some senses. How does this evolve into the future? Is this cut dry, we're done, cool, it's over? Or is there a comment period, or what could we see changing into the future?
So there's the act doesn't require any rulemaking by the bureau, so it will just go into effect as it is. The bureau has not indicated that they intend to engage in any rulemaking here. I think where you'll see the developments is on the opt-in provisions. It's fairly clear, whether someone will have an existing banking relationship with a bank or credit union, or whether you were the original, the originator of the loan, or you are the servicer. What's really going to be is, did a borrower, knowingly opt in, and how has that process worked? So I would expect to see credit bureaus coming out with some kind of certification, since they are relying on that by the third party. But I think that's where you'll see, the same issues that you see in the future. Much less, though, that borrowers arguing, I'm being contacted by this lender. I don't know who they are. Lender saying, well, you gave us an opt-in through something by visiting our website, or by clicking a pop-up. That'll be, I think, the area that we still look at. But the expectation is that the volume of trigger leads will decrease, and it'll be interesting to see what develops with those consumers who do want to opt in. Are they now going to get like 100 calls, or are there fewer purchasers of these trigger leads? So will it work out for them? That's just me speculating right now. I have no idea.
Well, I'll ask you to speculate a little further, because there's no way for you or me to quantify just how big of a hit this is to the bottom line of the credit agencies. But do you think it's going to be a meaningful drop in income for them? Do you think they're over there kind of wringing their hands like, holy smokes, there goes a huge revenue stream that we had?
I have not seen anything from the bureaus themselves on how significant this is. Sort of just based on reporting I've read and anecdotal stories that it's multiple millions of dollars of revenue, even though the cost per lead itself is fairly low. So yeah, I mean, I think that they will attempt to still sell these leads based on consumer consent, and we'll work to get that. There has been some talk too that, well, if this income stream goes away for them, are we just going to see an increase in credit reports? A further increase beyond the excessive ones we've already seen, and that's certainly a possibility. Although in this environment, with what the GSEs are focusing on and FHFA, I think you'd be rather brave of the credit bureaus to go on raising prices.
Yeah, good point. Before I let you go, any discussion between you and clients at Polunsky, Beitel, Green on opt-in provisions? Their thoughts on any ways you're advising people?
It's very early in the process so far. So we have clients that are thinking, if we wanted to have an opt-in, like how would we do that? Because the fear is, as I sort of mentioned earlier, that if it's not fully knowing, how would that work? And then for a lot of lenders as well, they sort of go through third-party vendors, so it's not a direct relationship with the credit bureaus themselves. But it's still early going. We really haven't gone far down that road with a client. But, I would definitely advise anyone that's thinking about doing this to engage legal counsel, because it is obviously an area of priority. And, it is an area where you could see class actions if it's determined, or alleged that you're not, obtaining knowing consent before purchasing trigger leads. There are, I guess, 10 states now that have some sort of restrictions, and those do something that the trigger lead bill doesn't do. They didn't ban it outright or limit it the way the federal law does, but they do require you to generally to identify who you are, and say that you're not with the original lender, and that this is, you're seeking, new business, basically. Because at the state level, the fear, to your point earlier, was that there's a lot of anecdotal stories about deception, that borrowers are receiving calls and the person on the other end is implying that they are representing the original lender that the borrower applied with.
Yes, a lot that will be unfurled over time, much like the NAR settlement. Even if people think something might happen, something completely different might happen. I'm sure we'll have you back on to discuss more. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, so thank you very much.
Same, Robbie.
30-year mortgage rates don't follow 30-year treasury bonds, but mortgage rates yet again hit new year-to-date lows and are at the lowest level since last October, per Freddie Mac's primary mortgage market survey for the week ending September 11th. The 30-year mortgage rate fell 15 basis points to 6.35%, and the 15-year rate slid 10 basis points to 5.50%, respectively. These levels are at their respective lowest since 6.32% and 5.41% on October 4th, 2024. Both 30-year and 15-year rates remain higher by 15 basis points and 23 basis points from a year ago. Just don't tell your borrowers that. You should tell them that mortgage credit availability improved in the MBA's Credit Availability Index in August, increasing 0.1% month over month. However, it remains below the May reading, which was the highest since August of 2022. Preliminary September Michigan sentiment is today's loan data point, but it probably won't move rates. Of note, in the prior report, 1- and 5-year inflation expectations were 4.8% and 3.5%, respectively. We began Friday with agency MBS prices a shade worse than Thursday's close, the 2-year yielding 3.55 and the 10-year yielding 4.03 after closing yesterday at 4.01%. Let's wrap up with a joke and some housekeeping. A man and woman had been married for more than 60 years. They shared everything. They talked about everything. They kept no secrets from each other except that the little old woman had a shoebox in the top of her closet that she cautioned her husband never to open or ask about. For all these years, he never thought about the box, but one day the little old woman got very sick and the doctor said she'd not recover. In trying to sort out their affairs, she agreed that it was time he should know what was in the box. The little old man took down the shoebox and took it to his wife's bedside. When he opened it, he found 2 crocheted dolls and a stack of money totaling $95,000. He asked her about the contents. "When we were to be married, my grandmother told me the secret of a happy marriage was to never argue. She told me that if I ever got angry with you, I should just keep quiet and crochet a doll." The little old man was so moved he had to fight back tears. Only 2 precious dolls were in the box. She'd only been angry with him 2 times in all those years of living and loving. He almost burst with happiness. "Honey, that explains the dolls, but what about all this money? Where did it come from?" "Oh, that's the money I made from selling the dolls." Thanks again to this week's sponsor, Indicom. Streamlining operations with the genius blend of automation, AI, and services, Indicom helps you achieve practical digital transformation and real operational impact with purpose-built mortgage solutions. To learn more, visit Indicom, that's INDECOMM.com.